The Iron Age is an archaeological era, referring to a period of time in the prehistory and protohistory of the Old World when the dominant tool-making material was iron. It is preceded by the Bronze Age in Europe and Asia and the Stone Age in Africa. Meteoric iron has been used by humans since at least 3200 BC, but ancient iron production did not become widespread until the ability to smelt iron ore, remove impurities and regulate the amount carbon in the alloy were developed. The start of the Iron Age proper is considered to fall between around 1200 BC to 600 BC, depending on the region. In most parts of the world, its end is defined by the widespread adoption of writing, and therefore marks the transition from prehistory to history. Chronology. The earliest known iron artifacts are 9 small beads, dated to 3200 BC, from burials in Gertsa, northern Egypt, identified as meteoric iron shaped by careful hammering. Meteoric iron, a characteristic iron-nickel alloy, was used by various ancient peoples thousands of years before the Iron Age. Such iron, being in its native metallic state, required no smelting of ores. Smelted iron appears sporadically in the archaeological record from the Middle Bronze Age, while terrestrial iron is naturally abundant. Its high melting point of 1538 degrees Celsius placed it out of reach of common use until the end of the second millennium BC. Tin's melting point of 231.9 degrees Celsius and copper's still moderate melting point of 1085 degrees Celsius placed them within the capabilities of the Neolithic pottery kilns, which date back to 6000 BC and were able to produce temperatures greater than 900 degrees Celsius. In addition to specially designed furnaces, ancient iron production needed to develop complex procedures for the removal of impurities, for regulating the admixture of carbon in combination with hot working to achieve a useful balance of hardness and strength, and for adding alloys to prevent rust. See ferrous metallurgy. The earliest tentative evidence for iron making is a small number of iron fragments with the appropriate amounts of carbon admixture, found in the proto-Hittite layers at Kaman-Kale-Hoyakan, dated to 2200 to 2000 BC. Akanuma concludes that the combination of carbon dating, archaeological context, and archaeometallurgical examination indicates that it is likely that the use of ironware made of steel had already begun in the 3rd millennium BC in central Anatolia. Sarkovasigolova shows that iron implements were made in central Anatolia in very limited quantities around 1800 BC and were in general use by elites, though not by commoners, during the New Hittite Empire. Similarly, recent archaeological remains of iron working in the Ganges Valley in India have been tentatively dated to 1800 BC. Tewari concludes that knowledge of iron smelting and manufacturing of iron artifacts was well known in the eastern Vindhyas, and iron had been in use in the central Ganga plain, at least from the early 2nd millennium BC. By the Middle Bronze Age, increasing numbers of smelted iron objects appeared in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. African sites are turning up dates as early as 1200 BC. Modern archaeological evidence identifies the start of large-scale iron production in around 1200 BC, marking the end of the Bronze Age. Between 1200 BC and 1000 BC, diffusion in the understanding of iron metallurgy and use of iron objects was fast and far-flung. Anthony Snodgrass suggests that a shortage of tin, as a part of the Bronze Age collapse and trade disruptions in the Mediterranean around 1300 BC, forced metal workers to seek an alternative to bronze. As evidence, many bronze implements were recycled into weapons during this time. More widespread use of iron led to improved steel-making technology at lower cost. Thus, even when tin became available again, iron was cheaper, stronger, and lighter, and forged iron implements superseded cast bronze tools permanently. Increasingly, the Iron Age in Europe is being seen as a part of the Bronze Age collapse in the ancient Near East, in ancient India, ancient Iran, and ancient Greece. In other regions of Europe, the Iron Age began in the 8th century BC in Central Europe and the 6th century BC in Northern Europe. The Near Eastern Iron Age is divided into two subsections, Iron I and Iron II. Iron I illustrates both continuity and discontinuity with the previous Late Bronze Age. There is no definitive cultural break between the 13th and 12th century BC throughout the entire region, although certain new features in the hill country, Transjordan, and coastal region may suggest the appearance of the Aramean and Sea People groups. There is evidence, however, that shows strong continuity with Bronze Age culture. Although as one moves later into Iron I, the culture begins to diverge more significantly from that of the late second millennium. History. During the Iron Age, the best tools and weapons were made from steel, particularly alloys which were produced with a carbon content between approximately 0.30% and 1.2% by weight. Alloys with less carbon than this, such as wrought iron, cannot be heat-treated to a significant degree and will consequently be of low hardness, while a higher carbon content creates an extremely hard but brittle material that cannot be annealed, tempered, or otherwise softened. Steel weapons and tools were nearly the same weight as those of bronze, but stronger. However, steel was difficult to produce with the methods available, and alloys that were easier to make, such as wrought iron, were more common in lower-priced goods. Many techniques have been used to create steel. Mediterranean ones differ dramatically from African ones. For example, sometimes the final product is all steel. Sometimes techniques like case hardening or forge welding were used to make cutting edges stronger. Near East, Southwest Asia, Middle East. In the Mesopotamian states of Sumer, Akkad and Assyria, the initial use of iron reaches far back to perhaps 3000 BC. One of the earliest smelted iron artifacts known was a dagger with an iron blade found in a Hattic tomb in Anatolia, dating from 2500 BC. The widespread use of iron weapons which replaced bronze weapons rapidly disseminated throughout the Near East by the beginning of the first millennium BC. Near East timeline dates are approximate. Consult particular article for details. Prehistoric Iron Age, Historic Iron Age, Ancient Near East. The Iron Age in the ancient Near East is believed to have begun with the discovery of iron smelting and smithing techniques in Anatolia of the Caucasus and Balkans in the late 2nd millennium BC. However, this theory has been challenged by the emergence of those placing the transition in price and availability issues rather than the development of technology on its own. The earliest bloomery smelting of iron is found at Tel Hammer, Jordan around 930 BC. The development of iron smelting was once attributed to the Hittites of Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age. It was believed that they maintained a monopoly on ironworking, and that their empire had been based on that advantage. Accordingly, the invading Sea Peoples were responsible for spreading the knowledge through the region. This theory is no longer held in the common current thought of the majority of scholarship, since there is no archaeological evidence of the alleged Hittite monopoly. While there are some iron objects from Bronze Age Anatolia, the number is comparable to iron objects found in Egypt and other places of the same time period, and only a small number of these objects are weapons. As part of the Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age, the Bronze Age collapse saw the slow, comparatively continuous spread of iron working technology in the region. The Ugaritic script was in use during this time, around 1300 BC. Ugarit was one of the centers of the literate world. Assyro-Babylonian literature, written in the Akkadian language of Mesopotamia, continues into the Iron Age up until the 6th centuries BC. The oldest Phoenician alphabet inscription is the Ahiram epitaph, engraved on the sarcophagus of King Ahiram from circa 1200 BC. It has become conventional to refer to the alphabetic script as Proto-Canaanite until the mid-11th century BC, when it is first attested on inscribed bronze arrowheads, and as Phoenician only after 1050 BC. The Paleo-Hebrew alphabet is identical to the Phoenician alphabet and dates to the 10th century BC. Europe. In Europe, the use of iron covers the last years of the prehistoric period and the early years of the historic period. The regional Iron Age may be defined as including the last stages of the prehistoric period and the first of the proto-historic periods. Ironworking was introduced to Europe in the late 11th century BC, probably from the Caucasus, and slowly spread northwards and westwards over the succeeding 500 years. The widespread use of the technology of iron was implemented in Europe simultaneously with Asia. The Iron Age in Europe is characterized by an elaboration of designs in weapons, implements, and utensils. These are no longer cast but hammered into shape, and decoration is elaborate curvilinear rather than simple rectilinear. The forms and character of the ornamentation of the northern European weapons resembles in some respects Roman arms, while in other respects they are peculiar and evidently representative of northern art. The dead were buried in an extended position, whereas in the preceding Bronze Age cremation had been the rule. Asia. The widespread use of the technology of iron was implemented in Asia simultaneously with Europe. In China, the use of iron reaches far back to perhaps 600 BC. Central Asia. The Iron Age in Central Asia began when iron objects appear among the Indo-European Saka in present-day Xinjiang between the 10th century BC and the 7th century BC, such as those found at the cemetery site of Chawuhukou. North Asia. The Prehistory culture is an Iron Age archaeological culture identified by excavated artifacts and mummified humans found in the Siberian permafrost, in the Altai Mountains, Indian subcontinent. The history of metallurgy in the Indian subcontinent began during the 2nd millennium BC. Archaeological sites in India, such as Milhar, Dadapur, Rajanala Kartila and Lahu Raid were in present-day Uttar Pradesh, show iron implements in the period 1800 BC to 1200 BC. Archaeological excavations in Hyderabad show an Iron Age burial site. Rakesh Tiwari believes that around the beginning of the Indian Iron Age, iron smelting was widely practiced in India. Such use suggests that the date of the technology's inception may be around the 16th century BC. Epic India is traditionally placed around early 10th century BC and later on from the Sanskrit epics of Sanskrit literature, composed between approximately 1500 BC and 600 BC of pre-classical Sanskrit. The Vedic literature forms 4 Vedas. The main period of Vedic literary activity is the 9th to 7th centuries, when the various schools of thought compiled and memorized the respective corpora. Following this, the scholarship around 500 to 100 BC organized knowledge into sutra treatises. The beginning of the 1st millennium BC saw extensive developments in iron metallurgy in India. Technological advancement and mastery of iron metallurgy was achieved during this period of peaceful settlements. One iron working center in East India has been dated to the 1st millennium BC. In southern India, iron appeared as early as 12th to 11th centuries BC. These developments were too early for any significant close contact with the northwest of the country. The Indian Upanishads mention metallurgy, and the Indian Mauryan period saw advances in metallurgy. As early as 300 BC, certainly by 200 AD, high-quality steel was produced in southern India by what would later be called the crucible technique. In this system, high-purity wrought iron, charcoal, and glass were mixed in crucible and heated until the iron melted and absorbed the carbon. India timeline dates are approximate. Consult particular article for details. Prehistoric Iron Age, Historic Iron Age, Sri Lanka. The protohistoric Early Iron Age in Sri Lanka lasted from 1000 to 600 BC. Radiocarbon evidence has been collected from Anuradhapura and Aligala shelter in Sigiriya. The Anuradhapura settlement is recorded to extend 10 hectares by 800 BC and grew to 50 hectares by 600 BC to become a town. The skeletal remains of an early Iron Age chief were excavated in Anaikodi, Jaffna. The name Kovita is engraved in Brahmi script on a seal buried with the skeleton and is assigned by the excavators to the 3rd century BC. Ko, meaning king, in Tamil, is comparable to such names as Koatin and Koputavira occurring in contemporary Brahmi inscriptions in South India. It is also speculated that early Iron Age sites may exist in Kandarodai, Matota, Pilapitiya and Tisamaharama. Southeast Asia. Archaeology in Thailand at sites Bandon Tafet and Khao Sam Kareo yielding metallic, stone, and glass artifacts stylistically associated with the Indian subcontinent suggest Indianization of Southeast Asia beginning in the 4th to 2nd centuries BC during the Late Iron Age. East Asia timeline dates are approximate. Consult particular article for details. Prehistoric Iron Age, Historic Iron Age, China. In China, Chinese bronze inscriptions are found around 1200 BC. The development of iron metallurgy was known by the 9th century BC. The large seal script is identified with a group of characters from a book entitled Shizhou Iron. Iron metallurgy reached the Yangtze Valley toward the end of the 6th century BC. The few objects were found at Changsha and Nanjing. The mortuary evidence suggests that the initial use of iron in Lingyuan belongs to the mid to late Warring States period. Important non-precious Husi-style metal finds include iron tools found at the tomb at Kuwaiti-Suan of the 4th century BC. The techniques used in Lingyuan are a combination of bivalve molds of distinct southern tradition and the incorporation of piece mold technology. For the Zhongyuan, the products of the combination of these two periods are bells, vessels, weapons and ornaments and the sophisticated cast. An Iron Age culture of the Tibetan Plateau has tentatively been associated with the Zhangzhung culture described in early Tibetan writings. Korean iron objects were introduced to the Korean peninsula through trade with chiefdoms and state-level societies in the Yellow Sea area in the 4th century BC, just at the end of the Warring States period but before the Western Han dynasty began. Yoon proposes that iron was first introduced to chiefdoms located along North Korean river valleys that flow into the Yellow Sea such as the Cheongcheon and Taredong rivers. Iron production quickly followed in the 2nd century BC, and iron implements came to be used by farmers by the 1st century in southern Korea. The earliest known cast iron axes in southern Korea are found in the Geum River basin. The time that iron production begins is the same time that complex chiefdoms of protohistoric Korea emerged. The complex chiefdoms were the precursors of early states such as Silla, Akia, Goguryeo, and Gaya. Iron ingots were an important mortuary item and indicated the wealth and prestige of the deceased in this period. Japan iron items, such as tools, weapons, and decorative objects, are postulated to have entered Japan during the late Yayoi period of the succeeding Kofun period, most likely through contacts with include the Korean Peninsula and China. Distinguishing characteristics of the Yayoi period include the appearance of new pottery styles and the start of intensive rice agriculture in paddy fields. Yayoi culture flourished in a geographic area from southern Kyushu to northern Honshu. The Kofun and the subsequent Asuka periods are sometimes referred to collectively as the Yamato period. The word Kofun is Japanese for the type of burial mounds dating from that era. Africa. In Africa, where there was no continent-wide universal Bronze Age, the use of iron succeeded immediately to the use of stone. Metallurgy was characterized by the absence of a Bronze Age, and the transition from stone to steel in tool substances. Sub-Saharan Africa has produced very early instances of carbon steel found to be in production around 2,000 years ago in northwest Tanzania, based on complex preheating principles. Nubia was one of the relatively few places in Africa to have a sustained Bronze Age along with Egypt and much of the rest of North Africa. The Meroitic script was developed in the Napatan period. Africa timeline dates are approximate. Consult particular article for details. Prehistoric Iron Age. Historic Iron Age. Ancient Egypt. In the Black Pyramid of Abusia, dating before 2000 BC, Gaston Maspero found some pieces of iron. In the funeral text of Pepi I, the metal is mentioned. A sword bearing the name of Pharaoh Merneptah, as well as a battle axe with an iron blade and gold-decorated bronze shaft were both found in the excavation of Ugarit. A dagger with an iron blade found in Tutankhamun's tomb, 13th century BCE, was recently examined and found to be of meteoric origin. Iron metal is singularly scarce in collections of Egyptian antiquities. Bronze remained the primary material there until the conquest by Assyria. The explanation of this would seem to lie in the fact that the relics are in most cases the paraphernalia of tombs, the funeral vessels and vases, and iron being considered an impure metal by the ancient Egyptians, it was never used in the manufacture of these or for any religious purposes. It was attributed to Seth, the spirit of evil who, according to Egyptian tradition, governed the central deserts of Africa. Sub-Saharan very early copper and bronze working sites in Niger, West Africa may date to as early as 1500 BC. There is also evidence of iron metallurgy in Termit, Niger from around this period. In Central Africa, iron working may have been practiced as early as the 3rd millennium BC. It was once believed that iron and copper working in sub-Saharan Africa spread in conjunction with the Bantu expansion for the Cameroon region to the African Great Lakes in the 3rd century BC, reaching the Cape around 400 AD. Sub-Saharan Africa has produced very early instances of carbon steel found to be in production around 2,000 years ago in northwest Tanzania, based on complex preheating principles. These discoveries, according to Schmidt and Avery, are significant for the history of metallurgy. At the end of the Iron Age, Nubia became a major manufacturer and exporter of iron. This was after being expelled from Egypt by Assyrians, who used iron weapons. Gallery